I'm David Hunt. My guest today, well, he's done a lot of things and he's lived somewhere very exotic. So let's start with him. He was born in Bendigo and raised there, went to uni here in Melbourne to become a lawyer. He became a lawyer. Went off to Japan, off to Japan, and did his master's in law in Japan, married in Japan and a Japanese lady, and then came back to Melbourne and has had a very up and down story to tell, which we'll get into that real soon. A sucker for fashion, he's obsessed with fashion. And he's now got this fantastic job, which we'll talk about because it links beautifully into his story. Hello, David. How are you today?
Same to you. Hello, David. I'm well, thank you.
I was going to do that. I was going to say, and so you beat me to it. All right, Bendigo, beautiful town. I was up there the other week to see an exhibition at the gallery. Fabulous old architecture, I found the people a little bit interesting. What was it like growing up in a town like Bendigo?
Gold rush, a lot of very Victorian architecture that's reminiscent of people having a lot of disposable income in the late 1800s. I grew up in what was a miner's, not a miner's cottage, I think a mine manager's house. So it was a double-storey Victorian mansion. In a terrible state of disrepair.
Right.
And my parents were both university academics at the what was to become La Trobe University, what was then a CAE, the Bendigo CAE. And so we didn't have a great deal of money, and the house was very large and falling to pieces and permanently different shades on the outside because it was my father's constant hobby to try and fix it up, and it never really did get fixed up. And in my earlier years, I was born with a physical disability, with a thing called talus dysplasia, which is where normally people have 2 feet next to one another. My ankle had a problem with it, so one of my feet was inverted.
Oh, okay.
Early surgery meant that they were able to correct the direction of the foot, but because it was the 1970s, medical technology wasn't what it is today. They severed all of the tendons, all the muscles, and all the nerve endings. So I have a foot that can move on the ankle and nothing else. I have no arch to the foot. There's no muscles in the toes. I can't move my toes, for example.
Right, okay.
The upshot of it is if I stand up straight and lift my right leg, I just fall over because I can't balance.
Oh, I must do that one day with you, make you stand on one foot. So that means you didn't play sport as a kid?
That's right. And I was talking about the house that we lived in, and it was just very difficult for me when I was very young, to get around, lots of stairs to climb.
Oh yes, of course.
In my very early years, I was in a wheelchair, and I had 2 shoes with a metal bar in between them to force my feet to grow together.
Yep.
And as you say, growing up, I don't have very good natural hand-eye coordination anyway, but I couldn't do physical activity. I still cannot do any kind of impact sport. I can't even do long distance walking.
Yeah.
I have early onset of osteoarthritis.
Oh no.
And it's something that's affected me throughout my life, and it's one of those kind of themes around which a lot of things in my life seem to circle.
And tell me, what was it like at school? With if you were wearing the braces on your leg, were you picked on?
Yes, I was. I mean, I watched Forrest Gump. And I liked Forrest Gump for a whole lot of reasons, but the braces he had on his legs, while different to mine, were rather reminiscent of my experience.
Yeah.
And I was this tall, skinny, probably quite effeminate kid, although I didn't really know what that was when I was particularly in primary school.
Yeah.
And I had this physical disability that meant I couldn't play sport. And the classic question I always used to get in my teenage years was, do you play football, do you play basketball? And of course I couldn't do either.
Yeah. And were your parents really supportive, knowing that with the disability and the fact that you would have been getting picked on at school? Were they really supportive? Was there a loving notion towards you because of that?
Interesting family dynamic that I grew up in. We were raised Catholic. Of course, one of the things that goes with Catholicism is that homosexuality is a sin. So that was something that was rammed down my throat from an early age, no pun intended. And the other thing was that my father, I think, was...
Hold on, I'm going to step back there. Why would they shove that down your throat about homosexuality? Were they maybe thinking that you might have been, or is it just a general thought?
I don't know. My father died many years ago. He developed motor neuron disease when I was a university student. He's been dead for 25 years. And I have heard stories from people after he passed away that make me wonder about his sexuality when he was a younger man.
Oh, okay.
Now, I don't know whether there was any kind of internalised homophobia there or what it was, but certainly I remember I was a teenager when the Grim Reaper with the bowling ball ads came out in the mid-1980s, I guess, and my father was, I remember my father commenting, it serves them right, that's what, that's what they should get, the gay cancer, the gay plague, whatever.
Yeah. And it's been proven through history that quite often the person that's saying things like that is hiding something.
That's right. And I mean, I will never know.
Of course.
My mother also passed away now 8 years ago. And these are some conversations which I haven't really thought about, or hadn't thought about back then and have thought about now and didn't follow up on. I don't know.
Yeah. So obviously you must have been quite smart as a kid, like going on to law. Why law?
I was interested in becoming the next rumpole of the Bailey, fundamentally. And the interesting thing with my education is, in year 10, I didn't fit in school. I was this awkward, gawky kid that I talked about. I found that I had difficulty relating to my peers. I didn't have very many friends, and I failed English. And English was the only prerequisite to go on to what was then called HSC. And so I would have had to have repeated year 10. And one significant thing happened to me, and that was that I was a high school exchange student to Japan for a year. And I don't know what happened in that year while I was in Japan, but I matured a lot. And when I came back, I had learned how to focus. And I went from someone who failed English in year 10 and effectively failed year 10 by failing English to getting a very high score in year 12 and going on to Melbourne University.
Wow, that's a really interesting what do you think was the turning point in you? Was it being away, getting an understanding of life a little bit more?
I think primarily it was independence, because I was away from what I felt was the fairly authoritarian, controlling influence of my father, who stories of gay men and their fathers, but a lot of issues with my dad. And also I went to a new culture that I'd never experienced before. I went there speaking zero language, and so I learnt to speak a foreign language in a year, not terribly fluently, but enough to be able to communicate with people. And I was left to my own devices a lot of times, so I just learnt to focus on things.
You would have stood out in Japan because how tall are you?
I'm 6'6", so
wow, that's tall.
That's quite tall, even for Australia. That's tall.
Yeah.
And the average height in Japan for males at that time was probably about 160 centimetres, and by comparison, I'm 197 centimetres.
Yeah.
So a big difference.
Yeah.
I got used to banging my head on the tops of doorways.
That's a funny thing. You don't think of that side of it. But what about, you see them crossing the streets and they're, there's thousands of people, and you would have been head and shoulders above everyone else. Would people look at you and want photos with you? And
yes, so this was the early 1990s. The world wasn't as international as it is now. The internet, of course, didn't exist.
Yep.
In fact, just making international phone calls was a very, very difficult process and very costly.
Yep.
No FaceTime or anything that you can use Wi-Fi for free on. And so, yes, I was unusual. I was white in a country where the people are of Asian ethnicity, and at that stage, 99.9% of everyone around me was of Asian ethnicity.
Yeah.
And I'm tall. So yes, people used to point, people used to stare, people used to laugh. They were polite about it, but people would come up to me and ask for my photo. And I remember going to Tokyo Disneyland, and the number of people that wanted a photo with me because they thought I was something to do with Disneyland.
If you put Mickey Mouse ears on, that would have been hysterical. So, okay, you came back after the year, and then you passed. And why? What was it about law? Why was it law that you thought that's what I'm going to study?
So, as I said, I was very close friends with my mother growing up, and I used to watch the TV shows that Mum watched.
Yep.
And Mum loved Leo McKern as Horace Rumpole in Rumpole of the Bailey, and that was the influence. Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was a semi-joke. That was
No,
really
deadly serious.
because that's why I wanted to ask it again. Okay, all right. So off you go. Did you enjoy university?
Yes and no. Once again, I found that I had difficulty making friends with people. I had difficulty socialising. I was coming to terms with who I was. I found that one way that was very easy to socialise with people surrounded drinking alcohol. Of course, I was of legal age then, so I was able to go to the pubs, and I also discovered that I had a capacity to drink quite a lot of alcohol in comparison to other people. So I have, born with a strong liver or something. And I wore that as a badge of pride. Drunkenness, like for many university students, was not an uncommon thing for me.
And especially law students as well.
Well, like just any students, Carlton is very close to Melbourne University. You used to go to Carlton and have a meal and have a couple of bottles of wine, and it was all fun and games, but it was the early signs of something that would later become a big issue in my life.
Right, okay. So you got through uni and you became a lawyer.
Yep.
What made you want to move to Japan? Was it because you were there as an exchange student and thought, let's try this?
So after I finished my undergraduate studies, I then got a scholarship to do a master's degree at a Japanese university.
Oh.
And so I went to Japan to university. That was my second time visiting Japan, and I studied at a university there and did a master's degree, and decided then that I wanted to stay and work in Japan. Now it's not, I was going to say it's illegal, it's against the bar practice there to admit foreigners to be lawyers in Japan, but foreigners can work in a paralegal capacity, and I got a job working for one of the world's largest car manufacturers. I won't say the name, and I started working there in their international legal department.
Right. And where did you meet your wife?
I met my ex-wife at Melbourne Uni. We were both students there.
Oh, okay.
She was Japanese, is Japanese.
Yeah.
And we had Japan in common.
Right. And so did she move with you when you went back there? Okay. Were you married here or there?
So we were living in Japan when we got engaged, and we got married in Japan and in Australia, and my bucks party was at the Peel Hotel, as you would expect for someone who's getting married to a woman the next day. And most of my friends said, "Don't do it," but I did it.
Right. Why did you do it?
So a question that I've often pondered. We were talking before this about how I tend to like the world as it's becoming. People don't need to come out. People can be who they are.
Absolutely.
I have a friend whose son is dating a man at the moment, but says he dates women. And I said, "Are you bisexual?" And he said, "No, I'm me." And I said, "When did you come out?" And he said, "I never came out." I love that.
Yep.
The world that I grew up in was very different. The HIV crisis was a crisis, and it had a lot of bad influences on our community, I believe. My Catholic upbringing was another thing. I wanted to please people. I wanted the validation from my parents.
Yep.
And I think that I just thought being gay is not an option in this situation. I have to be normal. I have to be conservative. I have to be mainstream. I have to be all of those words which can be so terribly pejorative in this sense.
Yeah.
I hated being me. Now, I talked about my father's potential internalised homophobia. I had internalised homophobia right up until the moment when things changed for me many, many years after when I got married.
Yeah. Okay, so here you are, you're married, and you're working in Japan. Then things started to go a bit wobbly, like the wheels started falling off. What happened to you in Japan with your job?
So I worked, as I said, I worked for one of the large automobile manufacturers. I then switched to working in a more of a marketing capacity than a legal capacity. I worked for a number of advertising agencies. I worked for some clothing companies, and in the marketing world, the advertising world, the clothing world, particularly the apparel industry, parties are a big part of the business. A lot of business meetings happen at parties, fashion shows.
Yep.
I've been involved with fashion for a long time. The party after the show is a really important part of the business.
Yep.
And there's the consumption of alcohol, and often there's fairly open use of a variety of different narcotic substances. I had been a fairly big drinker from university, and that theme continued. My tolerance for alcohol grew, as it does for all human beings, and it took me a lot more alcohol to get tipsy. And I was using things like cocaine and, to some extent, methamphetamine at that point. And you said the wheels started to fall off. The wheels started to fall off because my life had become completely unmanageable. I was creating a lot of problems. So in my early 20s, what happens on the tour stays on the tour. If I went out and got drunk and something regrettable happened, I'd laugh it off the next day. But by my late 20s, regrettable things were happening every day of the week, and sometimes multiple times a week. I would wake up not knowing where I was. I would spend money and not remember it. Of course, things like calling people and not remembering having conversations. Very fortunately for me at that time, neither Facebook nor Grindr nor eBay existed, but I was able to cause enough mayhem without those things.
Whoa, yeah. And so you lost your job?
I did. I lost my job. I became very depressed. I didn't understand what depression was then. I was hurriedly repatriated to Australia. I have a relative who's a medical doctor, and they thought, oh, well, you need to go on some medication and you need to do some other things. I was back in Australia, and I thought my marriage was over. It was still something I was holding on to. I was drinking a lot and using a lot of drugs, and I used drink and alcohol to escape, to feel good. Methamphetamine, otherwise known as ice, GHB, which is a gamma hydroxybutyrate, which is another drug that's used with methamphetamine, commonly associated with sex. Certainly they're both kind of stimulants, they make you feel good. I love the high feeling. Alcohol was what I would use when I was feeling particularly low, because if you're a little bit tipsy, then you feel happy, and I craved that happiness. Unfortunately, if you drink a lot of alcohol, your brain switches off, and I had alcoholic blackouts, and a lot of really, really horrible things happened, including a suicide attempt.
Right, and virtually living on the street.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So I spent a number of months sleeping out of a sleeping bag that the Salvation Army had given me, and eating at soup kitchens in the CBD.
Right, and you mentioned suicide, and it was a policewoman that
Yes.
that found you.
I was raised a Catholic, and I don't identify as believing in anything. In fact, I lean more towards being an atheist these days, but I call the circumstances in which I was found for my suicide attempt nothing short of miraculous. I had cut myself deeply. I was in hospital for 2 months after the incident, so it was a serious situation. And this female copper just found me.
In a park, was it?
Yeah, that's right. And I was transported to hospital in the back of a divvy van, and I was sliding around in my own blood.
Oh.
Then I was taken and sectioned, so forcibly institutionalised in a mental hospital.
Right. Have you met that policewoman since then?
I remember, this is all leading to me getting clean and sober.
Yep.
When I was clean and sober for 1 year, I really wanted to reach back to that police officer and say thank you. And I bought chocolates and went to the cop shop, and of course the cops couldn't accept that. So what I decided to do was just write a thank you card and send it to Victoria Police. That was the extent. I don't know the name of that police officer. She also gave me, I remember she gave me an Alpine cigarette at the time, which I was also very grateful for. I don't know, when I think of Alpine cigarettes now, it makes me think of the time when I tried to kill myself, and call it God, call it fate, call it what you will, something intervened, and I'm still sitting here today.
Since that moment, you like you don't take drugs, you don't drink anymore. Is that right?
Basically, yes. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite that smooth.
Right.
I was in in a psychiatric facility for a couple of months, and I was obviously clean and sober when I was in there. And when I left that psychiatric facility, I thought that I was cured, and virtually the day that I left, I went into a pub just to test the cure. And I ended up in a completely different suburb with no memory of how I got there.
Whoa.
So the transition to getting clean and sober took a little more effort than just not drinking.
Yeah, of course.
And what I discovered was that there is abstinence from drugs and alcohol, that's not consuming them. But the problem is life goes on. I still have friend groups. I still go out to places. I can avoid certain venues where drugs and alcohol are consumed, and I can avoid certain people, but I'm still me and I still experience the same things. And when I experience those things, then I find that I am emotionally triggered. And when I'm emotionally triggered, I want to run away.
Yeah.
So what I then found was that recovery, a process which is referred to in the community that is abstinent from alcohol and drugs, is something that deals with those core issues. And my core issues were never alcohol, were never the drugs. My core issues probably were that I was born with a physical disability and that I was a gay kid who grew up in country Victoria in the 70s in a Catholic family who decided to get married to a woman. Those are the kinds of things that were probably my issues.
So then you started working, you got caught up in the fashion industry because you love fashion.
Yep.
And you were travelling the world again.
Yep.
You're like, how was it different? Because you were working for advertising agencies in the fashion world
Yep.
in Japan. How did you cope with it, considering that you didn't want to go and do the partying and the drugs and the alcohol? It must have been difficult.
It was difficult, yes. So a big part of working, when I worked for advertising agencies, I worked for some of the world's largest labels. Once again, that shall remain nameless. And I went to Paris Fashion Week many times. And, I went to Paris Fashion Week and I would say to people, I'm on the vodka diet. And so far I've only lost 3 days. That's a joke. Parties, and I wouldn't remember what I'd done. I wouldn't remember getting on aeroplanes, getting off. Airplane lounges were terribly triggering for me. So when I tried to approach all of that from the perspective of someone who doesn't take drugs and who doesn't drink alcohol, then it was very difficult. And what I needed was the support of other people like me.
Yeah.
And it was through fellowships, and I know that sounds like a Christian church or like some kind of a church, and I don't mean that kind of fellowship, but fellowships like 12-step programs, people who have been in not dissimilar experiences to me, people who've been in not dissimilar situations to me, who supported me, people who have been abstinent and have better lives, who said, do this, do this, do this, and they made suggestions, and I didn't take some of those suggestions to my downfall, but I took a lot of those suggestions, and it was thanks to the experience, the strength and the hope that those people gave me that I was able to go back to Paris and go back to Fashion Week and, for example, go to Melbourne Airport and go to Airport Lounge and not have a beer, even though they're free, and not get obstreperous at some flight attendant because it's 10 o'clock in the morning and I want to drink vodka and then the bar isn't open yet, and me arguing that it's 5 o'clock somewhere on the planet. I was just able to live through those experiences, and I had a wonderful time.
Good.
And I had about 4 years of Paris Fashion Week, Berlin Fashion Week, working for a variety of different companies, having fun at the shows. And then when people started to get messy, when the people smoking marijuana and drinking champagne moved on to the cocaine and the other drugs, then I would just disappear.
Okay.
I took care of myself because I was there for the business. I'd exchange business cards, shake hands, meet people. I went to a couple of events that were attended by Anna Wintour. She's the editor of Vogue magazine in the United States. When I met her, I was so nervous that I had business cards and my hands were shaking. I spilt business cards all over the floor. But I was able to get through those things without drinking, without using drugs. And my career grew as a result of it. And I was grateful to be present.
Yeah. And how long's it been, David?
Well, September 2009 was my sobriety date, so it's been a little while now.
Okay, fantastic.
The way that I look at it is though, and this is rather a cliche, I look at it one day at a time. So,
Still.
Yes, still.
Wow.
One of my close friends, a dear friend, she says that the person who gets up earliest in the morning is the person with the most sobriety. So if my day lasts 24 hours and I just reset when I go to sleep, then it's the person who gets up earliest. And she always wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning, so she always says she has the most sobriety. Today I woke up at 5:30 and it was extremely cold in Melbourne, but that's my sobriety today from 5:30 in the morning.
Now, what are you doing job-wise right now? Something that fits in perfectly with your life and almost a godsend from my perspective. Am I right there?
Yes, no, absolutely. So I have worked in fields that I've been passionate about, and I've been lucky to be able to do that. And my first passion was the law. And my second passion was the clothing industry, the apparel industry.
Yep.
And I would say now that my passion is helping people. I have for a long time worked with other people who are newer to the attempt to try to remain clean and sober as a volunteer only, never in a paid position for the past 10 years.
Yep.
When I first met you, indeed, I was working for a community services organisation back then, and I was working there in a kind of a legal aid capacity, but I was providing voluntary services to homeless people on the streets of Melbourne who'd been in a not dissimilar situation to where I had been several years before. So I've done that as a volunteer up until now, and about 2 years ago I was given the opportunity to actually work in this particular industry. And I worked for a place that helps people to remain clean and sober, to get that first step of sobriety, but most importantly, to be able to maintain their sobriety sustainably.
Well, tell us, what's the name of it?
So the organisation I'm working for now, it's called Air 14. It is a place that has quite a different program than most other alcohol and drug rehabilitation facilities in Australia. And the simplest way of explaining that is to explain what Air 14 acronym stands for.
Right,
and it is Australian Intensive Rehab. 14 means 14 days.
Right.
Now, most rehabs are 28 days long.
Oh.
Indeed, there was a movie called 28 Days starring Sandra Bullock, which is a bit of a hoot, from the 1990s, and it's about a stint in rehab. And the classic thing is you go to rehab for 28, you go to the Betty Ford Clinic in America, you go there for 28 days, and you live there. It's kind of like jail.
Right.
In Australia,
is it like jail though? Or?
Well, it's like jail insofar as your movements are controlled. You don't have access to be able to, for example, go outside and go to the shop and buy something to stop people buying alcohol and drugs.
Yep.
And perhaps it's more like a convent school where the girls were locked in the 1950s. I don't know. I'm clutching at straws here, but people are in a kind of a locked ward situation. They live with one another. They attend classes. They attend group therapy sessions. They all do it in one kind of unit.
Yeah.
And they're there for 28 days.
Yep.
Now, in Australia, there was no reporting about the success of how rehabs were run, and in 2012, the federal government funded research called the Patient Pathways Project Report, and it looked over a 5-year period at a sample of people in public 28-day rehabilitation, private rehabilitation, people in psychiatric facilities and other places. It followed quite a large sample, and basically what it discovered was that less than 1% of Australians, when they are 1 year post-discharge from 28-day rehabilitation facility, less than 1% of them remain clean and sober. So basically it said that rehab in Australia doesn't work.
Yeah.
And a place that I was involved with more recently, it was a more traditional kind of approach. What I thought there needs to be a different way that people can look at this, because if people are spending a lot of money, and rehab is not cheap, to go to a psychiatric facility without private health insurance would cost someone about $30,000 for 28 days. To go to most private rehabilitation facilities in Australia, it's between $20,000 and $30,000. Therefore, people who can't afford it want government beds, and there are very, very, very few government-funded beds. So a lot of people are either remortgaging their house or accessing their superannuation or selling their car in order to go to rehab. And what they don't know is that the success rates are very low. So with Air 14, what the team that founded it tried to do was they tried to attack the problem straight on. And they saw that when people are in a rehabilitation facility, it's a bubble. You're surrounded by cotton wool. People get comfortable, people are not able to use alcohol and drugs, and people do learn things, but the day that they leave, they're back in the real world, and they're back to their family, they're back to life problems, they're back to a job maybe, or unemployment, as a lot of people are. They're back to all the stresses, and they're back to the fact that beer advertising is absolutely everywhere. Drug use is very common in a lot of the things that we watch on television and on streaming services. And of course friends, and friends are a terrible influence on us sometimes, particularly if we're trying to stop something. You know, I have tried unsuccessfully to stop smoking over the past sort of 10 years, and fortunately I haven't had a cigarette now for, it's about a month. I do use a nicotine replacement product, but if I'm with friends who are smoking, I feel the desire to want to have a cigarette. Now, if I'm trying to not drink alcohol and not use some drug, and I hang out with friends who are using that drug or drinking alcohol, then it's going to be an influence on me. So, at the Intensive Rehabilitation Program at Air 14, what they're looking to do is to have people live in their own homes. Now, there are lots of outpatient programs like this. There are things people can do online and you can do on Facebook, and there are a number of different programs, and they're not terribly successful either. So what we do is we offer rehab, but it's rehab where you don't live in a hospital. You live at home. So someone drives to your house first thing in the morning, picks you up, takes you to the facility. You have all of the components of rehab that you would have in an ordinary residential rehabilitation service, but at the end of the day, you get back in the car and get driven home, and you stay at home with your partner, with your children, with your parents, on your own if need be. And it's a real world experience, and it just means that the transition between rehab when it ends and your real life is much, much smoother.
Yeah, it sounds so logical. I can't believe that that hadn't been thought of.
No, indeed it does seem strange that no one has done this before. And as I said, there are a lot of outpatient programs, but they're usually a couple of hours a day. They're usually designed to complement someone who's been discharged from a residential rehabilitation program. That's not what this is. This is rehab, and it's every day of 14 days because there's a lot to cram in. And the big benefit to people is the overheads are so much less for the organisation.
Of course.
So the cost is less than a sixth of what most other rehabs charge in Australia.
Whoa, that's fantastic. How long's it been going?
It's been going now for 6 months.
Right.
And we have just opened a new facility in Malvern in Melbourne. We're small. We're a little bit choosy about the people that we take in. We really only take people who want help. So we don't want people there who are kicking and screaming and want to run away.
Forcing them to do it.
That's exactly right. We want people who are there because they want to be there. So we only take 10 people at a time. We tend to find that works good in a ratio anyway, because we have 5 clinical staff, so it means 1 staff member for 2 clients. And the process has been working well.
It's so new though. 6 months isn't a long time.
Yes.
Have you looked back at those people from the first time? Like, what's the success rate, or is it too soon?
No, a question that's always asked, and I think there are successes among individuals. Success rates are difficult to judge because, for example, I myself have been clean and sober now for a number of years. Does that mean that I'm a success? Does that mean that I'm cured? It doesn't, no. What the recovery process gives me is an ability to live life on life's terms without the need or the desire to reach out to alcohol or drugs or other dangerous behavioural things that I used to get myself involved in, one day at a time. And that's why we're very much on the focus on one day at a time.
And do you check up on the people after the 14 days? Is there some contact with them on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so part of the program is called Air 14 Next, and Air 14 Next is where we follow up, and certain patients, or certain clients rather, require far more intensive and direct contact, and with those people we're in touch with them 3, 4, 5 days a week sometimes. The other people, we have a minimum contact of once a week.
Yep.
And that service is provided inclusive of the cost of their admission in the first place, so it's not an additional thing.
How important is this for you, David, working within an organisation like this?
So when I worked in the legal profession, in a legal capacity, what I loved about it was the ability to generate arguments. I like the necessity of thinking on my feet. I like debating. I like that kind of thing about the law.
Yep.
That's what I was passionate about.
Yeah.
But I got a bit sick of that, I guess, over time, and then I found fashion, and like you commented on my shoes and my
bloody
socks
shoes,
and I have so many pairs of very
and those jeans, people wouldn't be able to see, but they've got like designer stuff with the right holes in the right places.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I've wasted a tremendous amount of money on terribly garish, terribly ostentatious, terribly colourful clothing.
What are you talking about? This shirt that I've got on?
It's a lovely shirt.
Who gave it to me?
I have no idea. Your fairy godmother, perhaps.
As a matter of fact, he gave it to me because he was getting rid of it and said, did I want it? And I went, yes. So thank you.
Bribed. I was passionate about that and still am. The thing that's most important to me is I almost lost my life at my own hand in 2009 because of poor mental health, and definitely poor mental health played a role in it. Because of my life situation played a role in it. But ultimately, the problem was caused by decisions that I had made, and one of those big ones was to put a mind-altering and a mood-altering substance into my system and to lose control. And I'm passionate about helping people who don't want to keep repeating the same poor behaviour and expecting a different result.
Yep.
And that's what being able to work in this job means. So I talked about how I'd done it as a volunteer for 10 years, and that was great. It was very self-affirming, and it made me have a feeling of giving back. But ultimately, when I do it as a job, it means it's something that I'm passionate about, something I'm interested in. I'm not paid a terrible amount of money for it, and I'm not greedy. I don't, apart from the ability to buy silly sneakers every once in a while, or loud shirts or something, I don't need a great deal of money. I get by. But it's something that I think is my calling, and I feel that the passion that I have for this is more important than the passion that I still have for fashion, but it's a hobby. And I'm able to use many of the skills that I had when I was working in the legal profession in this particular industry because of my ability to think about problems and to work my way through them.
Well, David, keep on fighting the fight and keep on being part of this wonderful organisation. What's it called again? Just
Air 14. AIR
14. Okay. David Millard, thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you, David.
And I'm David Hunt, and we'll be back again real soon on Bed TV.